So welcome everybody. My name is Christopher Keene with the American Geosciences Institute, and this is part of the AGI's Heads and Chairs webinar series. Would like to acknowledge Pranoti Asher, who's Assistant Director for Grants and Education Programs at AGU, and an AGI Scholar in Residence as well, as one of the co-hosts for today's presentation.
This is Pranoti Asher. Thanks for the introductions and for hosting today's webinar. So I'm very pleased that we are continuing our series with in partnership with AGI. So today's webinar is about the geoscience workforce and all the trends and impacts that the fine folks at AGI have learned from their COVID-19 study. So Leila Gonzalez is the technical specialist at AGI. Chris Keene is the director of higher education and workforce at AGI, and Lucas Potorak is working with them to delve into the data. So take it away, AGI team.
So what I'm going to do, before we dive into the very specifics on COVID-19, I'm going to give sort of an overview of where we stand in the geosciences. We have some fresh data related to enrollments and degrees and employment that I'd like to share. Most of this is really a benchmark for right before COVID hit, so hopefully it provides a context. I want to just note a couple things on enrollments. We've been seeing a decline in our undergraduate enrollments in the last couple years. Some of this, we have been seeing this on campus. Departments have been reporting this. Some of this decline is quite real, particularly with the softening of the oil and gas industry. And some of this decline in the numbers that we're reporting is also, we now have a number of major geoscience degree programs that are wholly online pre-COVID, before everyone had to rush offline. And the counting of those majors sort of has shifted from the departments out to their schools of online learning. So we're still trying to figure out that component. But regardless, we are down, but still doing quite well relative to historical proportions. The lower line is looking at graduate enrollments. And as you can see, we've been going the better part of 30 years or so at pretty much a steady state. This is the carrying capacity of geoscience programs at the graduate level. We are seeing a little bit increase right now, probably because of the softer job market. So when we look at the degrees awarded, a couple things I just want to point out. Obviously, they're just muted responses to the enrollment trends. But one thing that's caught our attention is the fact that the decline in bachelor's being awarded is occurring in parallel with the decrease in enrollments. Usually there's a bit of a lag. This is indicative that we have some upperclassmen who are switching majors or dropping out of school, something that we need to be keeping an eye on. Additionally, we are seeing an increase in the number of graduate degrees being awarded. This is, we're seeing greater completion of those graduate degrees, which I think is not a bad thing. And a lot of this obviously is being driven by somewhat of a softer job market in the last couple of years as folks have continued their education. But I wanted to just point one thing out. If you look back at the late 80s, early 90s, that's a tough time. That's actually a real crisis. So I think before people get too panicky about what's going on, the geosciences are in its historical context actually still doing really quite well. So one of the other big things that comes out is the question about diversity. One area of data we do have good consistent measures on is the rate of female participation in the profession. For degrees granted, as you can see, for enrollments, as you can see, we're pretty much been bouncing around somewhere in that 40–45% level. This has been consistent for quite a long time. The decrease that you see there in sort of the late noughts, early part of the 2010s is mostly driven by we had a sort of a slug of additional men coming into the enrollment, largely focused on trying to use the geology degree as a way to get onto the drill rigs. They have sort of moved on, and we are seeing a rebound to some of the historical levels that we saw before. The other thing too, as you can see, periodically our graduate gender balance is a little bit different than that of the undergraduate. And this is partly reflective that our graduate programs do recruit out from a wide range of programs and not always just geoscience. And as expected, the trends for degrees granted is pretty similar to that of the enrollments. One of the things you find is that on average, for the percentage of degrees granted is slightly higher than enrollments. And this is reflecting the fact that women actually do complete their degrees at a higher rate than men. And this also parallels what we are seeing in most industries, within the early career, now heading into mid-career, from their gender balance perspectives. Unfortunately, academia remains behind in this fact, but each industry has their own challenges within this space. And I just wanted to show, I'd like to show this to students. So when we go back and look at our geoscience student exit surveys that we ran for a number of years, and the colored areas are basically the topical area of folks' degrees, and the gray targets are the sectors in which their employment was. Obviously, there's a big throughput from directly geology to oil and gas that was reflective of the boom that was going on in shale gas, especially at the time. But I think one of the things that is good and is something to recognize as we look at the impacts of COVID is the diversity of pathways that all the different components of geoscience have, whether from a specific degree to a specific employment sector. So, and I think this is one of the resilience points that you'll see in the COVID-19 data. And then sort of my last pitch here. So when you look at total geoscience employment, over the last 20 years, you can see that there's basically a generally upward curve. There's a little bit of a bump there, 2013, 2014 timeframe. This again was the shale gas boom. But if you look long term, we're still on a steady growth. And this is one of the key things that the Bureau of Labor Statistics over the long term has been able to demonstrate, is that geoscience employment, total employment, tends to increase at just about the rate that the U.S. economy grows. So we've been doing well in that respect, and right up through before COVID, things were certainly on track. Now, internal to that, and something to always keep in mind, is there are shifts in what industries are the various components. Things in the oil and gas industry are definitely softening up, but one of the things we do see is shifting of that talent into other sectors, still doing a lot of the work, but perhaps the organization is different. Take it away, Lita.
All right, Chris. So I'm going to go ahead and continue what Chris has been talking about in terms of factors or data leading up to COVID-19, and looking specifically at projected employment trends, data that was just released by the Bureau of Labor Statistics this September. Now note that this is relative to changes between 2019, so last year, and 10 years from now. So what we're seeing here in terms of geoscience occupations, we're seeing a pretty good increase across the board for most occupations. Actually, I think, let me back up one slide here. I want to look at industry stuff first. Yeah, I skipped 2 slides ahead. There we go. Looking at, before we get into the employment projections, let's take a look at where geoscientists are working predominantly. And, following on what Chris said, a lot of geoscientists, 39%, are working within consulting, environmental services, and government industries. That would be public administration there, and then the professional, scientific, and technical services sector. Mining and oil and gas extraction, that's about 9% of where geoscientists are working. Educational services, so higher education, etc., that would be about 9% as well. So, but again, you can see across the whole set of industries, geoscientists work across a wide variety of sectors. And then I want to talk about, again, moving back into looking at employment growth over the next 10 years. Again, this is from 2019 over to 2029. So what we see here is that all geoscience jobs are expected to grow about 5.2% in the next 10 years. If you look at the data for all occupations across all industries, that's at 3.7. So we're doing better than that, and doing better than most other STEM fields except for computer and mathematical sciences. And that, I think, is a good point there, that having those computer skills allows you a wider array of options for job growth, and so that's just something to keep in mind there. And then the other point here on this slide that I wanted to point out was the largest growth that we're going to be seeing is within the environmental services sector, environmental science technicians, scientists, environmental engineers. Those have the largest projected growth of all the geoscience related occupations. And then if we look at employment projections by industry, now support activities for mining is at 33% expected growth. And this was, again, back in 2019 is when this model was projecting from until 2029. Definitely does not pick up what we're seeing currently in the softening of the oil and gas sector, and we'll get to that in some of the more recent industry data that we're looking at on a month-to-month basis. But we definitely see some softening there. But what Bureau of Labor Statistics did point out with this data set is that they expected that the mining and oil and gas industries would be sending a lot of the work to consulting firms in terms of exploration, production, and development in order to cut costs and save costs. And so that may account for the increase that we see here in the support activities for mining, as well as that also kind of falls across sectors into the professional, scientific, and technical services sector. So that can explain some of that growth there. And so moving on, let's talk about what we're seeing in the COVID-19 study that is currently ongoing. We just got a big slug of data in this week that we'll be looking at, so there will be some updates coming out through our Geoscience Currents over the next few weeks as we continue to report out on recent results and stuff like that. But what I wanted to talk about here is looking at departments and how COVID-19 has started to affect departments. So this is kind of a retrospective. As of February, expected budget cuts for the next academic year, for most departments, they were expecting about a 5 to 20% cut. We're going to go ahead and do a follow-up set of surveys to assess what the actual budget cuts were as opposed to what the expected budget cuts were. And so we can see here that over 20%, it was less than 10% of departments were expecting budget cuts of that large. And so let's go ahead and take a look at some other things here. In terms of personnel impacts, majority of departments are reporting no impacts. And you can see that percentage at the bottom of the slide here continuing to increase through time over the summer. Of those that are reporting impacts, the majority occurred during the springtime. So that would have been salary reductions, furloughing of staff, layoffs of staff and non-tenured faculty, benefits reductions. But we do see through the summer some reduced hours for staff, as well as staff furloughs still being reported by some departments through August. So we'll continue to monitor that and report out as we get more information over the coming months. And then looking at changes in how courses instructional formats have changed over the summer. What's been really interesting here is obviously we had the quick shift to all from in-person to online. And then what we're seeing is as institutions are reopening with safety measures, we're seeing this move back to in-person with social distancing, limited class sizes, but also this incorporation of flipped, blended, and high flex options as well, so that we can have in-person and online courses, and then the online only has come down. So we'll take a look at this as over September. Like I said, we just got some new data in this week that we'll be reporting out on to see if we we can pick up on some of the schools that have switched from in-person back to online only in response to some COVID-19 outbreaks at the institutions. The other thing that we're looking at in terms of lab sections, obviously in spring, we had almost over 90% of departments reporting changing their lab sections and classes to virtual and at-home activities. But similarly to what we're seeing with course formats, as we've seen facility access open up and restrictions there provide for people to be able to come back in person, albeit with all the safety measures in place. We're seeing an increase in departments that are reporting in-person labs and kind of a decrease there in virtual labs, not a concurrent decrease. So virtual labs are still occurring, at-home activities are still occurring, but we're also seeing that increase in in-person attendance and in-person labs. And then similar again with field instruction and activities, the percentage of departments reporting virtual field activities has decreased throughout the summer as we see more departments reporting local rather than remote, definitely more local activities going on. And there's been some interesting comments in the survey responses about how those activities kind of look. We're seeing comments about self-guided investigations, some departments doing in-person instruction with a very small number of students. So there's a lot of options that are being used to allow students to have that in-person local field activities, whether that's by themselves working their way through self-guided investigations or in-person instruction there with safety measures in place. So one of the things we also wanted to look at was how research and project activity impacts how things were changing in terms of research and project activities over the springtime. And what we can see here is that deferral of research and switching research modes to virtual was most common, deferrals being more common among faculty than among postdocs or students. And then also canceling active research also was more common among faculty. With the students seeing some comments there about students being allowed to continue research, especially if it was they were getting closer to graduation and needed to do that type of research in order to finish up their degree. So we also see students seem to be reporting less, basically no impacts than faculty. So that was kind of good to see, and we've seen some of that through time as we've looked at this question. Taking a look at research modes to see how that's changed, or at least how that was reported over the summer. Again, we see faculty and postdocs more frequently reporting doing fieldwork and lab-based activities than students, whereas the students doing more computational research, literature review, writing, and online research. And as we get into the fall term here, we'll see how this changes as well. One of the things we're also monitoring in our survey and our study is how recent graduates are doing. What we're seeing is that those that are graduating this year are predominantly reporting, over half of them are reporting they're not employed yet. Whereas those graduating between 2014 and 2018 are mostly employed as non-academic geoscientists. Even those graduating last year, again, are reporting mostly employed as non-academic geoscientists, excuse me. So we definitely took a look at that by year of graduation, but also we're looking at that by degree level. And overall, what we're seeing is that based on our previous surveys, exit surveys of recent geoscience graduates, we're not seeing a deviation from the long-term employment trends of recent graduates. So you do see this general trend where students come out of school, then they start looking for jobs, and then they pick up a job, months after they graduate. So it's that natural progress between graduation, job seeking, and then starting the new job. So that's good to see that we're not seeing a deviation from that long-term trend. That said, what also is good to see is that about just over 3/4 of unemployed recent graduates are seeking employment within the geosciences, and just over half are also seeking employment outside of the geosciences. And some of the most common reasons that we've seen stated for looking outside of geoscience profession has to do with a lack of jobs in the geosciences and lack of skills or training for those geoscience positions that are currently available. And we'll continue to monitor and report out as we get more information over the coming months. So stay tuned for that. One of the other things that we're also looking at is where recent geoscience graduates are finding employment. And we can see here that the industries where they are finding employment most commonly would be in universities, mostly as postdoc or staff positions. Again, in the environmental services consulting industry and government. So that aligns up with the other data that we looked at, looking at the overall industry spread of where geoscientists work. And there's a bit of a flip-flop here with geoscience graduates, with recent geoscience graduates finding a higher proportion of them finding work in higher education than that previous chart. But again, those are still the top 3 industries. And then I wanted to take us back a little bit and zoom out in our focus and take a look at some of the national data, looking at overall trends that we're seeing on a month-to-month basis in employment. And what we have here is data from the current population survey that the U.S. Census Bureau puts out. And what we're tracking, they provide monthly employment data by occupation. And what we've been able to do is look at all geoscience, solid earth geoscientists, and then early reporting occupations over since 2016 going forward, and map out a year-over-year change in geoscience employment so that we can kind of get an indication of where things are going for employment situation of the geosciences. What we're seeing here is we do definitely see an uptick between end of 2019 through early 2020 in year-over-year employment, and then we see that nice decrease there that is tapering off as of July and August. So as of August, we're down 2.4% year-over-year for employment for early reporters. But the good news here is that month over month, over the last couple of months, we've had month over month negative change in employment, and that has definitely kicked back up, and we're at a plus 20% there for month over month. The other thing to note here is that basically all geoscience and solid earth geoscience, those trends generally follow the trend of the early reporters. So we do expect to see, once we get that data from the current population survey, once that's released, we expect to see a similar trend in those 2 categories as well. So the early reporters give us a good idea of where things are going in terms of more up-to-date employment situation. The other thing I wanted to take a look at was unemployment claims by industry, since that information is also available at a national level, just to take a look at the industries in which geoscientists work at and compare those over time, because it's released on a monthly basis. And what we see here is, across all industries, quite honestly, April and May were the hardest hit due to COVID-19. But what's interesting here is that geoscience usually makes up, those geoscience industries usually make up about 9 to 12% of all unemployment insurance claim on a monthly basis. So in April and May, that percentage went down to about 6 to 7% because you see this large influx of people from the hospitality industry and retail filing unemployment insurance claims. And then in June and July, we see everything starting to get better. Geoscience is coming back to its normal levels, around 9 to 8%, 8 to 9%, and then 8% in terms of the percentage of total unemployment insurance claims. So that means that, and as we can see here, the percentage of change in unemployment claims year over year is coming down. It's not where it was pre-COVID, but it's definitely headed in the right direction. And just a point here that in July of 2020, over half of the claims came from hospitality, retail, and healthcare, and then also from those who did not specify what their industry was. So, but from the chart, you can see we're at least headed in the right direction, and that's good to see. And then I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Lucas to talk about employment by industry sector.
Thanks, Leela. So looking at the current employment statistics, the impacts on employment of the coronavirus pandemic were most negatively felt in April and May. After those months, employment rose into August, reflecting the continued resumption of economic activity across the U.S. As of August, employment was lower than in February of this past year, but indicates a return to normal levels as months progress. The government sector was responsible for 25% of the employment increase in August. This is mostly due to hiring for the 2020 census. Gains can also be seen in the retail, professional and business services, leisure and hospitality, and education and health services. Mining employment changed little in August, but has lost 95,000 jobs since December 2019, with support activities for mining accounting for most of those losses. Month-to-month change in employment by industry sectors indicates a growth or reduction in the negative impacts of COVID-19 pandemic going into August across sectors. Year-over-year changes in employment by industry sector looking from 2019 to 2020, peak employment numbers across sectors can be seen in January and February, excluding mining and support activities for mining. April and May show the most substantial negative change in employment numbers year over year, but moving into August, the negative impacts are abating. And then looking into the Small Business Pulse Survey, updates from the Small Business Pulse Survey for the month of August show that trends for overall impact, change in employees, change in revenues, and requested and received assistance continue trends seen in June. Paycheck Protection Program loan support continues to assist small businesses. The percentages of businesses reporting low operating revenues are decreasing, while a larger percentage are reporting increases in stability moving into August. There are low amounts of closures, change in employee numbers, and hours worked. 54 to 55% of small businesses reported they did not furlough or lay off any paid employees after March 13th, 2020. All indications from the Small Business Pulse Survey show that the impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic are lessening from March to August 2020. Overall concerns about the pandemic seem to be improving into August, and the data supports the sentiment.
Thanks, Lucas. And we're going to go ahead and take a look at some other data back from the survey from employers. And this is showing impacts to business operations through the summer. And what we can see here is termination and amending of revenue generating contracts continues to increasingly be reported by companies. Supply chain disruptions and contractor availability issues, that has gone down slightly over time, but it's still an impact reported by nearly 40% of businesses. And we're still seeing furloughs and layoffs occurring in July. We'll see if we see more of that going forward. And we see that salary reductions have decreased, but benefit reductions, reduction in benefits, we see an increase there in the percentage of companies reporting that. The good news is that the percentage of companies reporting facility access restrictions has declined. So just like what we see in academia with access to facilities, we are also seeing that in companies and employers in non-academic settings as well. And we have, again, like I mentioned before, new data that's going to be coming out looking at business operation impacts over the coming months. So stay tuned for that in our Geoscience Currents and the data briefs that'll be forthcoming. Taking a look at financial performance for companies, percentage of companies reporting lower financial performance than last year has remained near 60% over the summer. There, has been a slight change from about 58% in June, reporting lower than last year financial performance to 60% in August. The good news here that I really want to point out is that that's pretty much stayed pretty steady. So we do see a small percentage, 14% of companies saying that their financial performance is higher than last year in August. And similar to last year for about 26%. So we'll see over time if this changes, but we'll definitely be monitoring this to take a look at that going forward. We also wanted to take a look at how what a workplace policies were available to employees over time. So the black line there is what the situation was in February before COVID hit, and then we look at it at a monthly basis going forward. And what we can see here is a shift definitely to permanent and remote telework, but over time we're starting to see more limited in-office attendance, definitely an increase in fieldwork activities and site visits and lab access. And we'll see how that changes going forward. But that is good to see people being able to get out and do field work, access labs, do limited in-office work as needed, with the option to still do remote and telework as well. So next thing we want to take a look at is where the concerns are in terms of employers, and then we'll also take a look at concerns being reported by academic departments to kind of see where the issues are and as things are coming up. So in terms of employer concerns, workplace safety is definitely a top concern driven by the pandemic. The other things that are also being very much driven by the pandemic are the financial outlook of companies, ability to hire new employees, and also regulations related to business operations. So those are going to be the next top concerns. And if we look at departments, what we see there is workplace safety again being a top concern for departments, and it's actually a top concern for faculty and for students as well. There are concerns over hiring new faculty and new employees, yet only currently about 10% of departments report having active faculty searches. And then we do see a concern here over teaching with the agility of the department to adapt to new methods for instruction, which is also shared by the faculty. We see that in those responses as well. And we also see concerns here by departments for being able to retain and attract students. And yet what we see with students is they're more concerned with employability, and we also see that the intent for students, those who are not graduating, those who are continuing on in school, are definitely planning to return full-time next term. So that is definitely a good thing that we're not seeing this concern over retaining and attracting students and students saying that they don't want to return. In fact, we see the opposite, that students are planning to return full-time. And talking about plans for next term, right now looking at next term, so that would be upcoming, not the current term for fall, but the upcoming term. We're still seeing about almost 50% reporting no decision yet. About just over a third planning to do online instruction only, and then about 44% planning to have in-person instruction with safety measures, including hybrid formats. And most departments are reporting multiple options for next term. This is somewhat similar to what we saw early in June about plans for fall. So we'll see how this evolves over the coming months. And with that, I wanted to kind of wrap up. I know it's been a lot of data, a lot of things to digest here, but I wanted to share some comments that we've seen in the survey responses and looking ahead about, like, for example, virtual labs and field experiences. This last set of surveys, we asked about how departments and faculty saw integration of virtual labs and field experiences, how that would look long term. And some of the comments that we saw were the development of materials into introductory courses, so using them as modules that can be used to complement in-person instruction, using it for students that actually can't attend either the lab in person or the field experience, using the materials as enrichment activities, or using it for when in-person instruction can't take place. So for example, if you have inclement weather, or if you have health issues for the students or the faculty, or you don't have faculty that can actually provide in-person instruction, these materials that have been developed could be used as a substitute for that, or as a complement to existing course materials. So that was a nice thing to see in the survey results. And then some comments from employers about looking ahead in terms of how they see work situations changing long term. Seen some comments about a possible shifting to more telework in the long term. Definitely have seen some comments about positive impacts actually during the pandemic in terms of increased virtual collaboration between employees, and also some employers taking advantage of less travel in order to spend that time dedicating it to having more contact with clients via phone and email as opposed to in person. So definitely some interesting strategies there, and also positive strategies there. One thing that keeps coming up in a lot of the comments and as a challenge is challenges for those who are working from home, who also have children who are doing remote schooling. So that continues to be a challenge, and definitely not a small challenge at that. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Pranoti and Chris. And if you have any questions, we're definitely happy to answer them.
Great. Thanks, Leela. This was great. Thanks to you and Chris, as well as Lucas, for all your comments. We want to invite the audience to submit their questions through the question box, and so we'll be happy to take those on. And while folks are typing questions, Leela, I have a question for you that sort of popped up in my mind when you were showing some of your slides. You were alluding to one particular slide where you had students who have graduated and now looking for or are employed. And so the highest sector there was sort of higher education. Does this mean that there were students that were going to graduate school? Is that why that sector is so high, or was it because there were actually faculty jobs? I didn't think that's what you meant, right? It was undergrads or grad students that were continuing to seek other additional degrees, and hence the reason for the big jump in the higher education field?
That actually is those that are going on to postdoc positions predominantly,
Okay.
or working at staff positions at four-year institutions. So,
Okay.
you know,
Okay.
research staff or other staff positions. So that, yeah, that would be those.
Okay, so these were not students who are staying on for another degree in graduate school?
No, they
Okay.
would then be basically continuing on as a student and wouldn't be considered a recent grad.
Got
if
it.
that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
So I was also wondering if you had sort of thought about, or in your data, if you can tell if there's any sort of positive correlation between, you know, where the labs, facilities or labs are open, and as to what's going on with the trends in, you know, the spreading of COVID. So for example, does the geography play a role in whether, you know, a lab or a facility is open or not open, or the things that are going on in universities? Have you been able to parse the data to see any of those relationships?
I haven't looked at the geography question yet, looking at location of institutions and whether lab access is open or not. So that's a great question. I think what we'll be seeing coming up, you know, with some of the schools shutting down and going back to online only, I think we may be picking that up in the next round of surveys, but we'll see. But no, I haven't looked at geography.
Okay.
Location, but I'll put that in the hopper to take a look at.
Okay. So I don't know if there are other questions that are coming in. I'm having some difficulty here reading some of those questions.
So I can.
Okay,
chime
thank
in
you.
here. So you mentioned computer skills are you know, crucial for making you know, improving the employability of students, and you know, specifically what skills are important. Imagining GIS, but are there other specific skills that you know, in that computing space, you know, to improve their employability?
Yeah, and I'm going to defer some of this to you, Chris, as well, because you've taken a look at this. I think my comment there was looking at the increase in projected employment for those in computer science occupations, and I wanted to point to that as important for students, because that gives you another tool set and another way to broaden your horizons in occupational competitiveness. Chris, I know you've looked at this in some of the surveys and studies that we've done.
Yeah,
specific yet skills development, but definitely more than just GIS in terms of programming.
yeah. I mean, I think
needed
the key
skills to have.
thing you sort of have two components here. One, the application of these computer skills is largely about moving data into different analytic tools, things like that. In most cases, that does actually require programming. Python, something like that, abilities to filter and build workflows to improve efficiency, and in some cases hooking into back-end APIs that can deliver analytics. The other side of it too, though, is the folks that have the programming and the data analytics skills and similar things like that, is that you have a lot more companies out there in that space, and they do look for people with specific domain backgrounds. So if you are coming out with strong computing skills, but your domain background is in geoscience, then you're a prime candidate to be hired in those areas as well. So it really sort of comes both ways, for folks as far as building up their skill set. GIS is important, but I would also argue that just making maps isn't the key. You really need to understand the geospatial statistics, and using it as an analytic tool, is sort of where people are finding the value. So it's really in the data management, data analytics side for all the computing skills. So we have a person that does make a comment, and unfortunately this is something we're seeing, that the oil and gas that they have friends in oil and gas say the layoffs are still happening and recruiting is zero. Unfortunately, that's true. I know ExxonMobil just instituted a hiring freeze, for instance. And part of what's also happening is you do have this big shift. So where we saw, support services for mining. So in government parlance, that actually includes the oil and gas sector. These are groups like Schlumberger. So you have two things that are happening. You do have a downturn in oil and gas. And you have a shifting of a lot of that work is moving from the oil companies over to those service companies. So that's why you saw some of those components. The other big difference thing, as well, is the exploration side, sort of the way upstream components in oil and gas. That's, I won't say gone, but it is going to be far less important into the future for geoscientists. There just isn't nearly as much work to be done there. The oil and gas jobs for geosciences are going to be much farther downstream, in the production space, in the environmental management space, things like that. So that's a big shift as well. And unfortunately, the way a lot of oil and gas companies are set up, the pointy end of upstream is one company, and the production is a different, so unemployment, moving within the larger corporations sometimes is harder as well. So there is a big shift though going on.
Yeah.
I can ask the next question. So Leela, as you've been gathering data from departments, have departments sort of communicated on any kind of plans they may have for the next recruiting cycle, for fall 2021? Are they thinking about cutting back on the numbers of acceptances, and because they may not be able to financially support those incoming students? What are you hearing, or what are you learning from your survey?
I haven't seen anything specifically in the surveys on that. Chris, I think this will be a good question to incorporate going forward. So
yep.
Thanks for that. That's absolutely a fantastic question. We will definitely follow up on in forthcoming surveys. But Chris, have you heard anything about recruitment for 2021 in some of the discussions you've had?
No, when I've been talking to departments, I think a lot of folks' time horizons right now are a lot closer. They're more worried about what they're going to do for next semester. And I do think this is a really good question. I wouldn't say that that's been a targeted conversation we've had. And so I think we do need to incorporate that into our next round of surveying.
Absolutely.
So another question that's being asked is how large was the pool of recently graduated respondents? So sort of, I think, asking about N, N was how much?
Yeah, I'd have to go back and actually pull that actual number. One of the things that to keep in mind is we're providing point in time reporting out on this, and it's also a rolling enrollment in the study. So that number is going to grow over time until we finally close the study in spring of next year. But I'll have to follow up about that.
Yeah. So another question that has come in is as you're looking at all these various departments and programs, are environmental science or sustainability programs also included in your study? So can you speak to what those different departments are?
Yeah, absolutely. Predominantly in terms of the departments, there are geoscience departments that we're communicating with. We're also getting information from individuals, so students that have graduated with geoscience degrees. So I think, and Chris, you can jump in here too. Some of the departments that have changed their names to geoscience and environmental science. So I would say, yeah, they're included.
Yeah, if it's a geofocus program that supports in that area, yes. We don't necessarily have pure play, really sort of environmental policy oriented departments or biologically, like environmental programs departments that have come out of the biology side. But definitely anything within Geoscope that has that, we definitely do have the environmental science and sustainability area part of this.
Yeah.
And of all the employers that you've been surveying, have they sort of specifically sort of indicated, what skills have been useful for their employees to have? So maybe these are the ones that they were not furloughed or not laid off. What have you gotten any insight into those skills?
Not specifically in the surveys. We have asked about hiring strategies for and challenges with new employees, and that data will be forthcoming. But for employers, I think we're asking more at the employer level strategies for handling COVID-19, not specifically related to their employees. Okay. But we'll take a look at that going forward.
Yeah. Leela, you also mentioned that, the students who did not get jobs in the geosciences, they probably lack some skills. Did those students identify what skills, they lack? Did you get that sort of granularity in the data?
That we didn't get in the data. It's important to note is that the ones that were looking outside of geoscience, that's what they were commenting on.
Okay.
Why they were looking outside of geoscience industry was because the skills required for the jobs that they were looking at, they didn't have. But by and far, I think what we're seeing in some of the early data is students who are recent graduates, moving into employment positions over a few months. So it just kind of depends, and we'll take a look more closely at that going on. Again, because this is a multi-threaded survey, longitudinal survey, we're going to see over time, how long does it take for recent graduates to get jobs? How do people change jobs within this time period? And that's been one of the things I definitely want to look at as we get closer to the end, so we can kind of do that retrospective look back at how people have they stayed put in their job? Have they moved jobs? Of those that have become unemployed, how quickly did they find employment again? And that's going to be really important to see. So, but I think that's a good question as to what skills they see that they aren't having. So I'll put that on the list of things to follow up on as well.
So one attendee is asking about getting some insight on current scenario of doing online internship opportunities for overseas students in the U.S.
Great question. Chris, I'm going to defer this one over to you because I know within the survey we haven't looked at that specifically. Have you heard anything in any of your discussions about this?
Yes. So what we actually hosted this summer 4 virtual internships at AGI, folks from all over the country. And we had some applicants who were not permanent residents in the US as well. And so we had talked to our human resources folks. And fundamentally, the rules don't change, particularly if there's any compensation, related to that. So, if it's non-compensated and they don't get credit from a U.S. institution, then it's just it's a private engagement. So I think the key question is looking at you still have to follow your labor laws and check first with your human resources folks before you engage in that. I mean, unfortunately, the current political environment is very challenging for exactly these kinds of scenarios. But it was made clear to us that there's no skirting it, whether it's a virtual or, and in fact, the virtual internships have and I think this is just good for folks to understand, have an additional complication that whatever the rules are at where the internship is being, the organization hosting the internship, like in the case of AGI in Virginia, plus you have to add on whatever the employment rules are for where the intern is resident. And if there's a conflict, whichever one is the most restrictive wins. So whether it's minimum wage or work hours or any other guarantees like that. So you have to actually balance the laws between both locations.
Great. That was good. Good conversation there. So, any last comments you'd like to make with regards to your study? We're just 5 minutes away from the end of the hour. Please go ahead.
This is Chris. I mean, I think one of the things that struck me with this survey and the results are, in general, how resilient the geosciences actually have been with such a major shock. But I think the other thing too is how resilient and how creative the university programs have been in adjusting. And I think there's a lot of credit that needs to go out to folks in the that are in the departments to keep the education process going, coming up with new solutions, and it'll be very interesting to see how these perhaps infiltrate in the long run into the standard curriculum, going forward. So to me, it's actually sort of a good, as bad as the situation is, a good news story overall, even though there obviously are some clouds on the horizon.
Yeah. And I would say, to follow up on that, Chris, definitely in the survey, following on that resilience theme, we're seeing both in academia and also in employers for figuring out ways to make it work during the pandemic, to continue to teach students, to continue to do research, to continue to find ways to do the work that's needed for employers, different strategies for working within the limitations, but doing it creatively and with a certain amount of innovations and savvy. It's been really, really good to see just that ability to adapt. So that's been really good to see.
Yeah, and Leela, there's a question that just popped in. Says Greg is asking, I don't know how you would do it, but do you track employees within the geoscience sphere who got there from outside in terms of training, from being computer science or data scientists or whatever have you? They could be highly desired in the environmental services sector where they're surrounded by geoscientists, but their skills are in data management.
For within the survey or outside the survey, we have taken a little bit of look at previous degree fields with the national data, looking at degree backgrounds. Within the survey and within the study, one of the things that we look at, so people can opt in, and then we ask about degree background, and then follow up if, say, you have someone who is working, doesn't have a degree, or at least their most recent degree isn't in the geosciences, but they're classifying themselves as a geoscientist. So we definitely have a separate survey that will follow up and say, do you have a geoscience degree? What are you doing in terms of what you're working? How is your work related? So I think we do pick up some people who maybe have a different background, but definitely over time and over experience, they are working in the capacity as a geoscientist. Not many, but there are a few who are doing that. From the national data, you definitely do see some variation in degree backgrounds for people, but that's really hard data to get at unless you're doing person by person, and that would be a huge survey to do. But great question. Yeah, very difficult, but we try to do that.
Great. Well, thank you for answering that one. So thanks to all the attendees for submitting very insightful questions. And as you can see on the screen, a recording of today's webinar will become available in the coming weeks. If you have other questions that you didn't get a chance to ask during the conversation, but you think about those, feel free to email them to us and we'll try to get them answered. If you're a department head or chair, please consider joining the Heads and Chairs community. And if you'd like to participate in the, well, this year it'll be virtual, the Heads and Chairs workshop, information on that will be forthcoming in the next few weeks. So Leela, if you could go to the last slide. We can tell you a little bit about the next webinar that is coming up for the Heads and Chairs series, and it's about finding programmatic strengths and weaknesses. So please do tune in on October 9th. And then there are other webinars that are coming up related to the COVID series. This is happening on September 30th. It's a deep dive into the discussion related to geoscience employers and non-academic professionals. And then in November, responding to societal needs with 3D geology. It's a two-part series. So please join us again. And if you want to look at recordings of previous webinars, you can certainly find them on the AGI website. Just search for AGU Heads and Chairs webinars and you'll find them. So thank you very much for your attendance and we look forward to seeing you at a future webinar. Thank you.